Here's a compelling introduction for your YouTube video. It all started with a briefcase full of cash. A simple exchange, a quiet deal in a hotel room, and a promise of power and influence. The kind of thing that happens in the shadows, behind closed doors, where only a few know the real game being played. But this time, the cameras were rolling. This time, the people shaking hands and making promises weren't just any ordinary crooks. They were congressmen. This was Abscam, one of the biggest political corruption scandals in American history. It was a sting operation so bold, so audacious, that it felt like something straight out of a Hollywood script. FBI agents, posing as wealthy Arab businessmen, lured in politicians with the promise of money, connections, and political favors. Some took the bait without hesitation, stuffing their pockets with bribe money, unaware that every word, every handshake, and every dollar exchange was being recorded. What followed was a scandal that shook the foundations of Congress, led to multiple convictions, and changed the way corruption was investigated in Washington forever. And right in the middle of it all were the politicians who thought they could get away with it. Some of them were rising stars, men with promising careers, who saw an opportunity and took it without a second thought. Others had been in the game long enough to believe they were untouchable. But the moment those takes went public, everything changed. Careers were ruined, reputations destroyed, and the American people were left wondering, just how deep did this corruption go? Jake Tapper has spent years uncovering the hidden truths of American politics. And today, we dive deep into the Abscam scandal. Who were the congressmen caught in this web of deceit? What was going through their minds as they made those deals? And perhaps the biggest question of all, was Abscam a necessary move to expose corruption, or was it entrapment? Stay with us as we unravel the story of greed, power, and deception. By the end of this, you might find yourself asking, if this happened once, could it happen again? And if it could, is it already happening right now? The story of Abscam didn't start with politicians. It started with a con man. A man who knew how to move in the underworld, how to talk his way into deals, how to convince people that he was the real thing. His name was Mel Weinberg, and he wasn't the kind of guy you'd expect to be working with the FBI. But that's exactly what happened. Weinberg had spent his life pulling scams, making money off people who wanted something for nothing. Fake loans, phony investments. He was a master at making people believe in things that didn't exist. And for a while, it worked. He lived big, spent big, and never looked back. But then the law caught up with him. Facing serious charges, Weinberg had a choice: go to prison or work for the government. He chose the latter, and just like that, a career con man became the key player in one of the biggest political stings in history. At first, the operation wasn't even about politicians. The FBI wanted to catch criminals running financial fraud schemes. Weinberg knew the world of dirty money better than anyone, so they set up a fake company called Abdul Enterprises, supposedly backed by wealthy Arab investors looking to pour money into the U.S. if the right people believed the money was real. They'd do anything to get a piece of it. And that's exactly what happened. Small-time crooks and shady businessmen were the first to fall for the trap. They promised to make deals, to launder money, to use their connections to open doors for these supposed Arab investors. Everything was recorded. Everything was documented. But then the operation took a turn, one that would take it straight into the halls of power. That turn came when the FBI realized just how many people in positions of influence were willing to play the game. If middlemen and fixers could be bribed, what about politicians? That's when the plan shifted. If members of Congress could be convinced to take money in exchange for political favors, the FBI would have all the proof they needed to expose corruption at the highest levels. One by one, the targets were selected. Some of them had been involved in questionable dealings before, making them easy marks. Others had no idea what they were walking into. The operation had to be airtight, every meeting recorded, every transaction documented. And with Weinberg playing the role of the smooth-talking go-between, it wasn't long before the first congressman took the bait. The offers were simple: money for political favors, campaign donations in exchange for influence, a promise to help a businessman get government contracts in return for stacks of cash. Some of the politicians didn't even hesitate. They leaned in, listened closely, and when the briefcases opened, they took the money with a smile. They thought they were making a deal in private, that no one would ever know. But hidden cameras were rolling, microphones were recording, and every moment was being captured in crystal clear detail. One of the first politicians to get caught was Michael Myers, a congressman from Pennsylvania. He sat in a hotel room, listening as an undercover FBI agent, posing as a representative for Abdel Enterprises, laid out an offer. They wanted him to help with immigration issues, to use his position to make things easier for these supposed investors. And in return, they were willing to be very generous. When the cash was put in front of him, Myers laughed and said, "Money talks in this business." It was all caught on tape. Then there was Frank Thompson, a powerful figure in New Jersey politics. He'd been in Congress for years, a well-known name with connections. But when the offer came, he didn't think twice. He took the money, just like the others, never suspecting that his career was about to come crashing down. John Jenrette, another congressman, was also caught in the sting. He had a reputation for being charismatic, for knowing how to work a room. But charm didn't help when he was handed a bribe on camera. When the evidence surfaced, his political career was over. Behind closed doors, some of the politicians caught in the sting were starting to sense that something was wrong. The offers seemed almost too good to be true. The money was flowing easily. The promises of influence seemed limitless. A few of them hesitated, questioning whether it was all a setup. But by the time those doubts crept in, it was already too late. The tapes had been recorded. The evidence was locked in. And soon, names would be made public. Meanwhile, inside the FBI, there was another battle unfolding. Not everyone agreed on how the operation had been handled. Some believed it was a brilliant move, a necessary step to expose corruption in Washington. But others were worried about the ethics of it all. Had the FBI gone too far? Were they simply catching corrupt politicians in the act, or were they luring them into crimes they might not have committed otherwise? The word entrapment started to circulate, and some within the Bureau feared that when the dust settled, they would have as many questions to answer as the people they had targeted. The politicians who had been caught on tape were facing their own private nightmares. Some of them still had no idea what was coming. They went about their daily routines, shaking hands, attending meetings, giving speeches, completely unaware that behind the scenes, federal prosecutors were preparing cases against them. Others had begun to hear whispers, rumors that the FBI was up to something, that there was an undercover operation happening right under their noses. Panic started to set in. Some tried to cover their tracks, to figure out if there was any way to make the problem disappear before it became public. But there was no escape. The evidence was airtight. And once the indictments came, there would be nowhere to hide. For those who had taken the money, the reality was sinking in. Some of them had believed they were just bending the rules a little, that they were operating in the gray areas of politics where deals were made all the time. Others had convinced themselves that what they were doing wasn't really wrong, that it was just part of how Washington worked. But now, faced with the knowledge that they had been caught on tape, that every word they had spoken in those secret meetings was recorded, they realized the truth. This wasn't just a bad political move. This was a crime, and there would be consequences. But there was another angle to this story, one that no one saw coming. When the FBI finally made their move, when the tapes were revealed and the names went public, the reaction wasn't as simple as they had expected. Yes, there was outrage. Yes, there were calls for resignations, for justice. But there was also a wave of pushback. Some politicians and their allies claimed they had been set up. They argued that the FBI had created a scenario so tempting that almost anyone would have taken the bait. They pointed out that no actual policy changes had been made, no real favors had been granted, just discussions, just conversations. And suddenly, what should have been a clear-cut case of corruption became something else entirely. A debate about power, about politics, about whether the FBI had too much influence over elected officials. The press had a field day. Every headline screamed about bribery, about deception, about secret tapes and backroom deals. The American public watched in shock as politicians they had trusted were exposed one by one. But as the story unfolded, people began to wonder, was this just the tip of the iceberg? If this many congressmen had been willing to take bribes, how many more had simply been lucky enough not to get caught? In the middle of it all, Jake Tapper was one of the voices trying to make sense of what had happened. He looked at the evidence, at the reactions, at the deeper implications of the scandal. This wasn't just about a few bad apples. It was about the way power worked in Washington. It was about trust, about the relationship between politicians and the people they were supposed to serve. And it was about the larger question that no one could ignore. If this had happened once, could it happen again? As the trial dates approached, as the accused congressmen prepared to defend themselves, as the FBI faced scrutiny for their methods, one thing was clear: this wasn't over. The battle had just begun. The walls were closing in. One by one, the names were released, and the world finally saw what had been happening behind closed doors. The headlines were relentless. The footage, grainy, shaky, but undeniable, was broadcasted on televisions across America. Politicians, once seen as untouchable, were now caught red-handed, their voices on tape, their hands reaching for envelopes stuffed with cash. For some, it was humiliating. For others, it was infuriating. And for a select few, it was terrifying because they knew their names might be next. Inside Washington, the air was thick with fear and paranoia. Those who had already been exposed scrambled to find a defense, a way out, anything that might save their careers, their reputations, and in some cases, their freedom. Some denied everything, claiming they had been tricked, set up by a government that had gone too far. Others tried to explain it away. Just a misunderstanding, a moment of bad judgment, nothing more. And then there were those who stayed silent, waiting, watching, hoping that somehow they could escape the inevitable. But the FBI wasn't done. They had spent years gathering this evidence, and now they were making sure it stuck. The prosecutors worked tirelessly, preparing for the trials ahead. The charges were serious: bribery, conspiracy, corruption. If convicted, these men would not just lose their careers. They could lose their freedom. The stakes had never been higher. And yet, even as the legal process moved forward, something else was happening. A different kind of battle was unfolding, one that couldn't be fought in court. Behind the scenes, power brokers, lobbyists, and political insiders were working to control the damage. They knew that if the public lost too much trust in the system, it wouldn't just be these congressmen who suffered. It would be everyone in Washington. Deals were being made, alliances shifting, as some politicians tried to distance themselves from the scandal while others worked to contain it. Some even began whispering that the FBI had overstepped, that the entire operation had been unethical. The word entrapment kept coming up, and suddenly it wasn't just the accused who were on trial, It was the very people who had uncovered the corruption in the first place. In the media, the divide was growing. Some journalists praised the investigation, calling it a necessary step to clean up Washington. Others questioned the methods, asking whether the FBI had manipulated the situation, whether these politicians had been led into traps they might never have fallen into otherwise. The country was split. Were these congressmen criminals, or were they victims of an operation that had gone too far? Meanwhile, those facing charges were watching their lives unravel. Michael Myers, once a confident and powerful congressman, now found himself drowning in legal trouble. His own words haunted him, "Money talks in this business," a phrase that had once seemed like a joke, but was now evidence against him. Frank Thompson, a longtime political heavyweight, was seeing his career crumble in real time, his years of influence wiped away by a few moments of greed. John Jenrad, known for his charm and charisma, could no longer smile his way out of this one. And yet, some of them still believed they could fight back. Lawyers were hired, statements carefully crafted, and arguments prepared. They would argue that this was a setup, that they had been pressured, tricked into taking the money. Some would claim that they never actually intended to follow through on any favors, that they had just been playing along, testing the waters. But the evidence was overwhelming. The videos, the recordings, the stacks of cash changing hands, it was all there. The truth was inescapable. Then, just when it seemed like the story couldn't get any bigger, something unexpected happened. A rumor began to spread. There were more tapes, more names, more politicians who had been caught in the web of Abscam. The FBI had only revealed part of what they had, and now Washington was on edge, waiting to see who would be next. The fear spread like wildfire. Some congressmen avoided their offices, afraid of reporters, afraid of subpoenas. Others quietly reached out to lawyers, preparing for the worst. The tension was unbearable. No one knew how deep this really went, or when the next bombshell would drop. And then the trials began. The moment of truth was finally here. The accused politicians walked into the courtroom, trying to keep their heads high. But the weight of what was happening was impossible to ignore. The evidence was laid out for all to see. The footage played, the voices echoed through the courtroom, and the undeniable reality of what had taken place hit everyone like a punch to the gut. Some politicians refused to look at the screens, unable to watch themselves caught in the act. Others sat frozen, knowing that every second of that footage was destroying what was left of their careers. The prosecutors didn't hold back. They painted a picture of greed, of betrayal, of public officials who had sold their power to the highest bidder. The defense attorneys pushed back, arguing that their clients had been unfairly targeted, that the FBI had set them up. But the jury wasn't just looking at arguments. They were looking at the tapes. And the tapes didn't lie. As the closing arguments were prepared, the entire country waited. The press speculated endlessly. The American people debated what it all meant. Was this the beginning of real change in Washington, or just another scandal that would eventually be forgotten? Would these politicians be held accountable, or would they find a way to slip through the cracks? And then came the moment everyone had been waiting for, the verdicts. The tension in the courtroom was thick, the air heavy with anticipation. Some of the accused sat rigid, others tried to remain emotionless. But no one could ignore what was about to happen. The decisions made in the next few moments would decide their futures. Careers, reputations, legacies, everything hung in the balance. And then the judge began to speak. The courtroom was silent as the judge prepared to read the verdicts. The accused congressmen sat motionless, their fates hanging in the balance. Reporters leaned forward, pens ready, cameras rolling. This was it, the moment that would define everything. The charges had been laid out, the evidence dissected, and now After weeks of testimony and arguments, the jury had made its decision. But just as the first verdict was about to be read, an unexpected interruption sent a shockwave through the room. A low murmur spread across the courtroom as a court official hurried toward the judge's bench, whispering urgently. The judge, who had been poised to deliver the final word, frowned, nodded, and then turned to address the room. Something had happened, something no one had seen coming. Before anyone could process the moment, the courtroom doors burst open. A defense attorney, looking flustered and frantic, stepped forward, waving a stack of papers in his hand. His voice was urgent, his tone filled with something between desperation and triumph. He had new evidence, he claimed, something that could change everything. The entire room froze. The prosecution, caught off guard, immediately objected. This was unprecedented. The case had already been tried, the jury had deliberated, the decision was about to be made. But the defense insisted. This was no ordinary piece of evidence. This was something that could challenge the very foundation of the case. And then, with a look of quiet certainty, the defense attorney dropped the bombshell. There was another tape. A ripple of shock moved through the room. More tapes. The FBI had already presented what they claimed was their full set of evidence, the footage that had condemned these men in the eyes of the law and the public. But if there was another tape, one that hadn't been shared before, what did it contain? The defense attorney, now speaking with the weight of the moment pressing down on him, explained. This wasn't just any tape. This recording, somehow overlooked or deliberately withheld, showed a different side of the story. On it, the FBI agents running Abscam could be heard discussing their approach, debating how far they were willing to push the politicians they had targeted. And then came the real twist. One of the agents, caught on tape, seemed to express doubts about the operation. His words weren't direct, but they were enough. "We might be forcing this," he had said. "Some of them wouldn't take the money if we didn't make it so easy." The room erupted. The defense's argument, which had once seemed weak in the face of overwhelming evidence, suddenly had new weight. Entrapment, the very accusation that some had whispered about but never fully proven, now had a voice behind it. The prosecution scrambled to respond, arguing that this tape didn't change the facts of the case, that the politicians had still taken the bribes, still made the deals. But the damage was done. The certainty that had once surrounded the case was now fractured. Outside the courthouse, the public was in chaos. News of the new tape spread like wildfire, and suddenly, opinions began to shift. People who had once been outraged at the corruption now started questioning whether the entire operation had been fair. If the FBI had pushed too hard, if they had created a scenario so tempting that even an otherwise honest politician might have fallen into the trap, then what did that mean for the justice of the case? Had the government gone too far in its quest to expose corruption? Behind the scenes, pressure mounted. Calls were made to the highest levels of government. Some in Washington, who had initially supported the investigation, now started to distance themselves. Others, still reeling from the scandal's impact, saw an opportunity to rewrite the narrative. The story was no longer just about corrupt politicians. It was now also about the lengths law enforcement would go to bring them down. And then, just when it seemed like the case had reached peak uncertainty, another shock hit. One of the key FBI agents involved in Abscam, someone who had worked directly with the undercover operation, suddenly went missing. At first, it was dismissed as a coincidence, a misunderstanding. But as the hours stretched into a full day with no sign of him, the questions grew louder. Had he run? Was he hiding? Or had someone decided he knew too much? The stakes had never been higher. The lines between justice and manipulation, truth and deception, had blurred beyond recognition. The public, once sure of who the villains were, now found themselves questioning everything. And as the trial hung in limbo, with new arguments, new evidence, and new fears surfacing by the hour, one thing was certain: this story was far from over. The disappearance of the FBI agent sent shockwaves through Washington, turning an already explosive scandal into something even more unpredictable. The agent, a key player in the undercover operation, had vanished without a trace, leaving behind unanswered questions and a storm of speculation. Some believed he had gone into hiding, fearing the backlash of the newly surfaced tape that suggested entrapment. Others whispered about something darker, that he had been silenced by forces who had too much to lose if the truth ever fully came out. As the courtroom emptied and the final verdict settled in, Washington found itself in a state of uneasy reflection. Some politicians had been convicted, their careers and reputations shattered beyond repair. Others had escaped with lighter sentences, while a few had managed to walk free entirely, their cases too tangled in the controversy surrounding the investigation. But even as the trials ended, the scandal itself refused to fade. The public had watched every twist and turn unfold like a political thriller. But now that the dust was settling, new questions lingered. The FBI had exposed corruption, but they had also exposed themselves. Had they done the right thing in the wrong way? Had justice truly been served, or had the pursuit of convictions overshadowed the need for fairness? People argued about it in living rooms, in newspapers, on television. Some still believed that the politicians deserved everything they got. After all, they had taken the money. Others felt uneasy, wondering if the entire operation had been manipulated for maximum impact, rather than for the sake of true justice. For those caught in the middle of it all, the consequences were real. The convicted congressmen reported to prison, some defiant, others resigned to their fate. Their families bore the weight of their downfall, their names forever tied to the scandal that had rocked Washington. Those who had been acquitted faced a different challenge, returning to a political world that no longer trusted them. Some tried to rebuild their careers, but most found that once your name was dragged through a scandal like this, the damage never fully went away. Even if they had avoided prison, their legacies had been rewritten. And then there were the investigators, the men who had orchestrated Abscam. Some retired quietly, slipping away from the public eye before more scrutiny could follow. Others defended their work, insisting that, despite everything, the ends had justified the means. They had uncovered corruption at the highest levels of government. That was the goal. But the methods they had used would forever remain a point of controversy. The missing tape, the edited conversations, the aggressive tactics, these were things that couldn't be ignored. The very institution that had sought to expose wrongdoing had, in some ways, tainted itself in the process. For the American people, the scandal became a lesson in trust, who to trust, when to question authority, and how power could be wielded in ways that weren't always black and white. The shock of seeing elected officials accepting bribes on hidden cameras had left a deep scar, but so had the realization that even the agencies meant to uphold justice weren't immune from overreach. Washington had always been a place of power and deals made behind closed doors, but after Abscam, those doors never seemed fully shut again. People paid closer attention, journalists dived deeper, and the idea that corruption could thrive unchecked no longer seemed so distant. Years later, the story of Abscam remained a cautionary tale. It was studied in law schools, debated in political science classes, and analyzed by journalists who still weren't sure what to make of it. It had changed the way undercover operations were conducted, forcing the FBI to tighten its procedures and rethink its methods. It had changed politics, making officials more wary of entrapment, but also more creative in how they conducted business away from prying eyes. And perhaps most of all, it had changed public perception, reminding people that power, in any form, could always be abused. As time passed, some of the figures involved faded into history, their names remembered only in old news clippings and documentary specials. Others tried to reclaim their stories, writing books, giving interviews, attempting to control the narrative of what had happened. But the truth, as always, was complicated. In the end, Abscam had been about more than just bribery and corruption. It had been about the lengths people would go to in pursuit of power, whether they were politicians, investigators, or those caught in between. It had been about ambition, greed, and the thin line between right and wrong. And long after the trials had ended and the headlines had moved on, the questions it raised still remained, lingering like a shadow over Washington, reminding everyone that sometimes, even when justice is served, it doesn't always come clean.